So I'd like to welcome everybody tonight. It's great you're here. This is just a dazzling place. I've been here a few times, but every time I'm here, I'm always impressed. And the excitement, there's lots of events going on here tonight. This is always a great venue, and we're really happy that our DC alumni and others are with us tonight, and it should be a great discussion. So we host dozens of panels and discussions on our campus, so Westwood is abuzz with these types of activities, but not so often that we hold events actually in DC. And the last sort of panel discussion we had in DC was probably almost a decade ago. I think I've been Chancellor for 12 years, and I must have been maybe my second year. And I remember Frank Mankiewicz was here, I think, and participated, if I remember, who was just, we fondly remember as such a special person who contributed. Since then, there's been a lot of changes in Washington, and that makes for a lot to discuss tonight. And part of UCLA's role as a public university is to act as a convener for important discussions about not only the university, about America and the world. And I think universities, really can play that role to bring people together to discuss critical issues. And we have a special kinship with journalists. Not only do we educate journalists, but we do work closely with them in so many different venues, and this is no exception. And that's why I'm thankful that we have really an outstanding moderator tonight, David Lauder, who is joining us. David is the Washington bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. He began working as a journalist here in Washington in 1981, and since then has covered Congress, the Supreme Court, the White House under Presidents George Bush and Bill Clinton. Then from 1995 to 2011, he decided he needed better weather, and he worked for the Los Angeles Times, actually as foreign editor and deputy metro editor, and I believe he was actually in Los Angeles during that time, so he had some tenure in Los Angeles. We're thrilled to have him here tonight. This is really a special opportunity for us. We think you're all busy people, and we know it's not ever so easy to get any place in Washington, just like Los Angeles, so we really appreciate you being here. We look forward to the evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. I want to introduce our other two panel members. On my far right, Youlonda Copeland-Morgan is the vice provost of UCLA for enrollment management and one of the education world's leading experts on admissions and all things related to who actually gets to go to college and where. So we'll look forward to what she has to tell us. And Elizabeth Mears, who is at Hogan Lovells, for those of you who don't know, one of the city's leading law firms just down the street. She's been in practice of higher education law for about 3 decades. So knows a lot. And there are obviously a lot of legal issues that have to do with who gets to get into colleges and universities, what they get to do when they're there, and how they treat each other, and what people like the Chancellor can get away with. So
not much.
So there are a lot of issues that we can talk about tonight. I want to ask our panel members several things, and then we'll try to reserve some time at the end for questions from all of you, since I'm sure all of you have things you'd like to ask as well. I thought I'd start out just by asking about one of the really big changes in the higher education world that really started in the late 90s, but has accelerated a lot more recently. Our public institutions of higher education, whether UCLA or University of Michigan or University of Maryland or whatever, are not really as public as they used to be. The level of state support for higher education has dropped a lot. It began to decline in the 90s and then really kind of dropped off a cliff in most states with the Great Recession, and has only slowly started to recover in some places. I checked on the more recent figures. In 2018, state spending nationwide on higher education was still $7 billion below the peak that it reached in 2008, adjusted for inflation. So that's about 16% less on a per student basis. California is actually a little better than most states. It's now back pretty much level to where it was in 2008, which is not true elsewhere, although even in 2008 it was a lot lower than where it had been when, as the Chancellor said, I moved out to California in the mid-90s. And it's worth noting, and perhaps not entirely coincidental, that this drop in government support for higher education has coincided with a time at which the student bodies of most public institutions have become much more diverse, and the number of white students relative to non-white students has gone down. So with all those numbers as background, I wanted to ask our panelists to talk about how the decline in state funding has changed the way public universities operate, and what you see as the outlook and where things are going, and whether public institutions can really fulfill their mission at a time when they're increasingly reliant on private donors.
So, I could start, I would just tell a story first. I was at the University of Virginia for 29 years, and I still remember distinctly, my wife and I were driving out of Charlottesville, listening to the news, and hearing that, the state of Virginia was going to decrease support for the institution by another 3% or something. And I thought, thank goodness I'm going to California, which absolutely supports its institutions. No worries. No worries. Within 1 year, we had dropped, within 2 years, we had probably dropped about $200 million in state support after 2009. So it was really a shock. So, I would say UCLA is public in its DNA. That is, if you look at the access that it provides, look at the demographics of the students. I think actually the New York Times once said it was City College of this century. Literally what City College was to the last century of New York, this is what UCLA is to this century. It really is still an escalator for so much opportunity. But the funding has changed dramatically, as you pointed out, and it's really in some sense becoming more of a privately funded public to some extent. Privately funded tuition has gone up dramatically, so students are expected, so it's no longer a public good, it's turning into a private good for families. So students are asked to bear a larger share of the responsibility. Philanthropy plays a larger role, but there's other things at foot as well. We're very concerned now about other new revenue sources, intellectual property revenues. We're needing a different mix of support to keep it public and its mission, but the mix of support is changing. And I think we are reaching a very challenging point. I think students are frustrated and families that it's gotten very expensive. UCLA now is probably $13,000 in tuition, but then living in LA, whether you live on campus or off campus, turns it into quite an expensive proposition for most families. So it's very expensive, especially for middle-class families. We provide a lot of aid for low-income students, but very expensive for middle-class families. And so it's a struggle, and I am concerned because I don't think tuition can rise much more. I'm very concerned about that. State support remains stable with slight increases, which isn't sufficient. So we're scurrying around thinking, what are we going to do over the next decade? And it's interesting, Berkeley is struggling with an acute problem with finances. If those of you have followed it, Berkeley has fell off the cliff and is running deficits, and they're scurrying, deciding how it can actually, balance the budget. We have so that's an acute problem. We have more of a chronic problem. Over the long run, UCLA can't keep this level of quality with this level of resources, so we've got to find new sources, and part of it's philanthropy. We're looking to people to donate for scholarship support, make it more affordable. Part of it's got to be other revenue-generating activities, whether it's online programs, more master's programs, or more intellectual property harvesting of our intellectual property. So it's a challenge, and I think we're still doing a good job, but we're challenged.
Youlonda, as the Chancellor was saying, that tuition is only obviously one part of the cost. So obviously, one of the things that universities have been to try to increase financial aid, but if financial aid only deals with tuition rather than the costs that students have for living, that doesn't really necessarily make meet the need, right?
Right. No, it's a real challenge. And I think a part of it that we have to recognize that is happening is higher education used to be a partnership between the state government, the federal government, local support, and the family. But what we see is a decline in federal support that has put more pressure on state dollars, more pressures on the families. And then when you're in a state like California, where you have enormous diversity, lots of first-generation college students, working class folks who are not making enough to even pay the living costs, then it does put a unique burden on public institutions that we weren't prepared to shoulder. But the one thing I will say is what I see every day is that families are willing to sacrifice everything to send their children to college because they know that that is the fastest way to participating in what we call the American dream, right? And it's critically important given the diversity of California because when you look at the disparities in wage earnings, right? The data shows that if you're a white male, for example, educational attainment doesn't have the same impact on your income as it does if you're Latino, for example, where every step, the more education you receive, the more of a change you're going to see in your income. So it is last year when universities lost the federal Perkins loan program, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I never thought I'd see any of the programs that were created under the 1965 Higher Education Bill go away. It's always enjoyed bipartisan support, and the federal Perkins loan for us, when that program went away, that was $8 million in federal aid that we no longer had to address the financial needs of middle-income and low-income students.
I would just add that the federal government is hearing some of this concern among universities at the state level, and the Higher Education Act is going through a reauthorization process now. Potentially, one of the proposals that has been made by in the Senate and the House on the Democratic side is to encourage federal-state partnerships that would encourage states to invest more and reinvest in higher education, including a concept borrowed from the elementary and secondary education world called supplement, not supplant, which means that essentially the states need to use the federal money to add to their own commitment to education funding.
Yeah. Senator Alexander does seem to want to get a higher education bill passed before he retires, so
We'll see.
Maybe it'll
happen.
Maybe.
It's only 10 years.
Yeah. So another big issue that has been roiling the higher education field, the president just the other day signed an executive order on campus free speech. It's not really clear whether the executive order actually does anything. It doesn't actually create any new substantive law or rules, but leaving that aside for a moment, the fact that he felt that there was political mileage to get by signing the order tells us something about how the idea of that there's a conflict about free speech on campus has become a sort of a political cause, and it's clearly true that that campuses do attract a lot of controversy. Some of it is generated on campus. Some of it comes from groups who realize that if they show up at a prominent campus like UCLA, they can attract a lot of attention to their cause, and that puts a lot of burden on campuses. Berkeley did a report a year or so ago in which they noted that in 2 months, August and September of 2017, they spent $4 million simply on security surrounding a couple of controversial speakers. But at the same time, free speech and free inquiry are at the heart of what universities are about. So I wanted to ask you to talk about both the legal issues and the sort of management issues of how you deal with with these controversies, and what the principles ought to be, and also how it affects the goal of creating a community on campus where students feel both educated and safe.
So, this has been a challenging issue, I think, on all campuses. And, our guiding principle has always been the First Amendment, that we believe that people should be able to come to campus and speak freely, whatever their viewpoints, and be listened to, at least without students or others preventing people from being heard. So we feel very strongly that we should protect the right of everyone's free speech. And we've been quite successful, I must say. We've had a number of conservative speakers, because usually it's conservatives that have attracted a lot of attention and opposition. And I would say, from Ben Shapiro was there, and Milo Yiannopoulos, who's sort of a clown, and provocative. And he spoke, I think, 3 years ago without much incident. And Charlie Kirk. We've had a number. Steve Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, who's somewhat controversial. We've been able to get through these. We've gotten rather strict about this, and we do read a warning when we think it's going to be a controversial talk. We warn everyone that they need to be respectful, and if they're not respectful, we're going to ask them to leave. If they're not going to leave, we will arrest them. And we've done that a few times. It turns out most have been non-students, so it's people coming from the community that have been disruptive. But it's challenging. We want students to invite speakers. We think that's a good idea. We don't censor who they invite. But then we're stuck with the security costs. And we often charge students for just the standard security costs of an event, but any exceptional costs we have to cover. So we do worry about that. And I worry about every event that it's going to lead to some situation like they had at Berkeley where it's going to be highly disruptive. But knock on wood, it's been fairly successful. And I think that's true for most campuses. And I think the president has several times mentioned Berkeley. And Berkeley's an outlier. The events they had at Berkeley, and that one event with Yiannopoulos was really an outlier. We've not had problems. So I think free speech on campuses is protected. You do hear complaints from some conservative students that they're not fully comfortable on campus. I hear complaints from very religious students that they're not fully comfortable on campus. So I think campus climate, not to defend it, we have to work on it. It's for lots of groups, that campus can be a place that's not as welcoming as it should be. But free speech, I think we've been able to protect quite effectively, so I'm not sure we need it. And we, as a public university, have to protect the First Amendment, but I'm not sure that the president's decision here and recommendations are actually really needed.
I'll leave the legal issues to you to address, but one of the things I will say as someone who's on the ground with students every day, one, I think this is a great thing that our students are engaging in these conversations, right? We want them to have these conversations. This is what college is about. But also the power of making a statement and setting expectations, what the Chancellor just mentioned, that just setting the expectations has really made a difference, to say, we expect you to come here and listen and respect each other, be heard. And so, there are many solutions one could implement, but I have been very surprised at how just sharing your expectations about how we're going to engage each other has really impacted our students and their conduct.
I think the Chancellor has very well expressed the legal principles behind the First Amendment, and institutions can't discriminate among speakers based on the content of their speech. They can set reasonable time, place, and manner limitations, and there are a few exceptions when there are threats or incitements to violence and so on, where the institution can do more consistent with the First Amendment. But I think there is concern in the higher education community about the executive order. As David said, its effect isn't clear. It's a directive, basically, to the agencies to develop policies and procedures for essentially dealing with research funding and compliance of institutions with the First Amendment that receive federal research funding. Exactly how that gets implemented or administered is as yet totally undefined, but I think the concern is just having the federal government trying to manage or enforce, the First Amendment. That would be unprecedented in our history.
So another significant legal issue that has been an issue in higher education for basically my entire lifetime, I guess, is affirmative action, particularly in admissions. I went back recently and was rereading some of the history around the 2003 Supreme Court decision that upheld the use of affirmative action in a case from the University of Michigan. At that point, the deciding justice on the court was Sandra Day O'Connor. One of the key deciding points for Justice O'Connor in that case was a chart that was attached to one of the briefs, and it showed what had happened to the number of Black and Latino students at University of California campuses after the passage of Proposition 209 in California, which outlawed the use of race-conscious measures. And the chart showed a line that went like this, and the number of Black students in particular had really plummeted. And Justice O'Connor was dismayed by that, and that very much, at least according to her biographers, was a key factor in her deciding to uphold the use of affirmative action in the Bollinger case. So now the swing vote on the court is obviously no longer Sandra Day O'Connor. The court has moved to the right. There's a lot of expectation that affirmative action is an issue that they may revisit sometime in the next couple of terms. And the future of affirmative action, particularly in admissions, seems clouded, to be sure. But it's worth noting that if you did the same chart, the numbers would look very different. That despite the strictures that Proposition 209 has imposed, University of California has managed to turn those numbers around, at least to some significant extent. Particularly UCLA has had a pretty good track record on this. So I thought it would be useful to talk about if there's a likelihood that, or at least a possibility that the rest of the country may soon be operating under a regime somewhat similar to Prop 209. What have you all learned about what you can do, what you can't do, what works, what doesn't work, what the practical limits are of what you can accomplish under that kind of legal restriction?
So I'm going to turn this over pretty quickly to the Vice Provost, who was recruited specifically to help us be successful, and she has miraculously done that, and we've better and better, although it's a struggle. But when I first arrived, the year before, the number of African American admissions to the freshman class was roughly had reduced to less than, I think, 100. They were worried it was going to be less than 100 of a fairly substantial, about 4,000 student class, I think, coming in 2006, something like that. And here's a university that has Ralph Bunche as a graduate, and Jackie Robinson and Arthur Ashe. It's a place where African Americans have thrived and become leaders in their communities, and so we have a really proud history of accomplishment of African American graduates, and it was just disappearing. And we made some changes. First we changed to holistic admissions, which I think Berkeley was using, that let us evaluate students within the context of coming out of low-performing schools, first in their families to go to college. We began to use a number of criteria that were not race-based, but were legitimate criteria to use, and we began to improve. But it was a struggle, and I must say, when Vice Provost Copeland-Morgan came, she had the skills to figure out where the students were, because it really requires getting the pool of students, finding out where they are. These students are out there, but you have to locate them, and you got to convince them that UCLA is a place for them to attend. And I think we've been increasingly successful, but this is very challenging. So I think I probably should turn it over to an expert.
I don't know what that bio says about me, but let me just say, put some context around this, because I didn't read it, but put some context. So I spent 34 years in selective higher education before coming to UCLA, and I'm in my 8th year now at UCLA. And UCLA, like many public institutions, did not operate like private institutions. In private institutions, you cultivate the relationships in different ways, making a distinction between recruitment and outreach. And recruitment really is about the immediate cultivating an admission of a class. So recruitment is usually around 11th graders and 12th graders. Outreach is about building relationships. And one of the unfortunate things that had happened prior to my coming as a result of the decline in state funding is that the institution in key areas did not have the staffing that was necessary to do the kind of intrusive outreach that's needed in minority communities, right? So I really believe you have to, for first-generation college students, that the key to our success is building relationships of trust with their mentors, with their families. Their mentors are college counselors and the AVID and Upward Bound individuals, community-based organizations that share our mission. And I was fortunate with the Chancellor to talk about resources, right? And then the next thing was to bring in folks who thought of admissions, have always thought of admissions as being holistic. In my profession, admission must be holistic, right? And holistic simply means that you evaluate students based on how well they've taken advantage of the educational opportunities available to them. So you're not comparing students from a rural community and the number of, for example, honors courses or AP courses or other kind of courses that they had available to a highly selective private institution in the city. And so what you're looking for, and a key to our success, is looking for students who have made the best of the educational opportunities available to them. And that, there are proxies for that, looking at where they are in the class. In California, we pay attention to those individuals who graduated in the top 9% of their class, or the top 9% statewide, which is one of the kinds of tools that we've used to help. And you know, one of the things I will say, in all of my years in admissions, I've never heard of my colleagues admitting someone because of their race. Race adds context, just as if I would describe myself. You can say a lot of things about me, but when you then say, and she's African American, and she's from the South, or whatever those things are. And so really what this holistic admissions has allowed us to do is look at students beyond test scores, beyond their GPA, and say, how does the rigor that this student has taken relate to the rigor that's available? Did they take those advanced math, so on and so forth? Now that said, and also I will say this, because I'm a firm believer on this, and this is where my passion comes out, right? Is you cannot expect that admissions recruiters are going to spend the same time doing an admissions workshop, same 1 hour, 2 hour, doing an admissions workshop at every high school. If you have second and third generation college students that you're speaking to at one school, and the other one is full of first generation, you've got to explain things. You've got to explain the process of an AA to a bachelor's to a master's to a PhD. You've got to talk about the residence hall. It takes a lot more time. So another major adjustment that I've made at the university is that, one, everybody's got to recruit in diverse areas, everybody, because we represent the state of California. Our goal is to make sure that we're reaching out to the full state. And everyone, regardless of their backgrounds, needs to understand what it means to fulfill the university's mission. And so now counselors have that freedom to spend time in communities to cultivate those relationships, so that when we ask parents or headmasters or principals or college counselors to send us their best student, they have to believe that we're going to take care of those students. And that's really been a part of this. Jean's been involved in the work. I'm able to ask that, Chancellor, it'd be great for you to come out and meet with this group. We've spent time using other tools, searching for these students, identifying them through various academic indicators, and that has made a difference. But I will tell you, it's tough work. Proposition 209 is a challenge for us, and it's something that needs to be overturned. Not so that we can admit students because of race, but so that we can use it to understand better the context, the environment in which students come from. And that even students who we think of being the same, all low-income students don't have the same experience. And we have to recognize that. If a low-income student from a rural community versus an urban community versus a suburban community, they're going to have different kinds of experiences when they start their morning for their school day. And so, the last thing I would say is we've done a great job, but I am so dissatisfied with where we are, because when you use 2006 as the floor for where we were when we were less than 100, and we're over 600, for example, in African American students, they still do not represent the percentage of the high school graduating class that they represent, and particularly for Latino students, where graduation rates are still slightly behind whites and African Americans, but more and more of them are graduating from high school, and we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that they're represented. Our Southeast Asian students, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians. So a lot of work to do, and 209 is a real challenge. It was a real challenge for me to come into a state that I'm from, come back to a state, and work on these issues. But we've got a good set of people, and we've got great leadership. And let me say this, one last thing is, enrollment officers like me follow the lead of our leaders and the institutional mission. And you've got to have that leadership from the top, and then everybody on campus, from the faculty to the staff, everybody has to understand that that's a priority. And fortunately, when I arrived to UCLA, it was already in our DNA, so I didn't have to do that kind of convincing.
I would just add that regardless of what happens at the Supreme Court level, down the road in this area, the lessons that UCLA and other institutions in California and the other states that have these bans on considering race in admission are valuable to institutions everywhere, because one of the criteria that the Supreme Court has set for taking race into account in admissions is that the institution have considered race-neutral alternatives. So they need to think about whether they could utilize effectively the strategies that you're required by law to use before they can take the next step.
So since we were talking about who gets in and what the criteria are, I really ought to ask about the subject that's been in the headlines the last few weeks, which is really, when you boil down to it, preferences at the other end of the economic and social spectrum. We've had this scandal of cheating in the admissions process, and that has generated a lot of coverage, particularly in LA, because so much of this particular case was focused in Southern California. So my colleagues out in LA have written a lot about it. But one of the reasons why this story has generated so much attention nationwide is it really crystallizes a lot of issues about privilege and money, and how those go together, and about the way people regard institutions of higher education as a status symbol, and how that can affect decisions. But I wanted to ask you about one sort of somewhat more narrow subset of this, which is the degree of preference that goes to athletics, which is sort of the side door, as Mr. Singer, who was at the center of this thing, described it. There was a study done not too long ago at Williams College that they looked at all of the admissions decisions and found that athletes were 30 times more likely to be admitted than non-athletes with similar academic records, which was a far larger preference than any other that was given. And a lot of the sports that are at the center of attention in this scandal, and also in general, we're not talking about football and basketball. We're talking about non-revenue sports that are pretty expensive to participate in as a teenager. So you're talking about a process that gives an advantage to affluent, mostly white families. And my colleague Teresa Watanabe, who covers higher education for us, referred to it as affirmative action for white kids. It raises the question of, should colleges and universities be providing this level of preference to athletes in these non-revenue sports? Or is that something that should go away?
So, I think this is a very legitimate question to ask. And, we have historically, I think most institutions have given preference when doing admissions to a small group of athletes, that just like we give preference to a small group of artists who have exceptional talents, who might not have the highest SAT, but are the greatest musician you could imagine. So there's groups of people that we use different criteria to accept. But I understand the criticism that when you look overall at the non-revenue sports, I mean, the sports that are generating revenues are very diverse. But when you get to some of these other sports, they're much less diverse. So I think it's a legitimate, I think this is something universities are going to have to ask themselves, whether this is a practice that should be continued. And again, I'll turn this over to our vice provost, because when you deal with not that I'm avoiding the question, but that she deals directly with admissions.
Yeah, no, I echo what the Chancellor is saying, that it is a question to be asked. I think particularly as the number of sports has expanded to where, as you've said, by their very nature, they are sports that kids from privilege are playing, right? I mean, so you can name those sports, and it's not that UCLA has all of them or any school has all of them, but they are not football and basketball and baseball, right? And there are a number of other ones there. I think it's a legitimate question. I think in the news, that we have one individual that has been named, whose parents have been named in this situation. I think what really it has to take place as a result of this, and this is my second Division I institution, is institutions have to examine the places in admissions where we depend upon our campus partners to help us with admissions decisions. And I will say this is in any talent, as the Chancellor just alluded to, in any talent-based majors. And so I'll give you some examples of that. So in admissions, we evaluate the student's academic strength. At UCLA, we read every application twice. And that was another huge change that we made. Every single student application is going to be read twice.
And how many applications do you get?
We have over 135,000 applications. So that's another story for another visit. But in certain majors, arts, architecture, film, television, theater, dance, and music, we need the expertise of our faculty partners to review those portfolios to help us make admissions decisions. So I just want to say, those aren't as, salacious or as athletics, but you are absolutely right. The pain point is that this is just another indication of where, for those hardworking kids who are coming from first-generation backgrounds or disadvantaged backgrounds, and saying more privilege to those who are privileged. And I think our responsibility is to, when we learn about it, is to evaluate, make sure that students and families don't benefit from wrongdoing. Right, and that's what we value. And institutions have to look at their mission and their values and make sure that we're doing everything possible to ensure that students who are getting into our colleges and universities are actually earning their way in.
So I've got a long list of questions that I could ask our panel members, but I do want to make sure that we have some time for you all to ask questions. So I think we've got 2 mics. And who's got a question? Over here. And remember, we call these questions because we want you to ask a question.
I received 3 degrees from UCLA, a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. And I want to talk about ask a question about graduate education. I graduated from the history department, which at the time that I went to UCLA had 100 faculty members and about 400 graduate students, most of which would never have the opportunity to secure a tenure track position. After I left UCLA, I became a college professor, and I would see this. We were admitting students into the program more than the number who had a realistic opportunity to go on and to be a college professor. How do you sort of evaluate a system of graduate education where many of the students are coming to be college professors with a system that's so inundated with applicants that most of them will never get that opportunity?
So the point you bring up is a really good one, and in many areas now there are way too many graduate students for the number of jobs because we're not in a growth economy in terms of education. We're really just replacing faculty, most institutions. So we've dealt with that, I mean, and we're dealing with it. So I'll tell you the tensions here. In one sense, you look at the number of history graduates and you say, well, the number of PhDs, if you're just looking at individuals who will become faculty members, we've got to make the program much smaller. We're just not being very ethical if we keep the program large. So in one sense, that's easy. I mean, we have to just make the program smaller. The challenge becomes, and this is where I think the self-interest vectors kind of collide sometimes, is, you know, that PhD students are often teaching assistants. They perform a teaching mission for the university that takes care of the large number of undergraduates we have, because we've got a very large cohort, 30,000 undergraduates. So there's this tension between, well, we need PhD students actually to help us with the mission of teaching, but it's not necessarily in the best interest of the students to have them because their career trajectories look so questionable. So we're struggling with that, and we're actually in many areas we're reducing the number of PhD students. We simply have to, and thinking about other ways to provide teaching support for our undergraduates. The other alternative is to find better alternative careers for people getting PhDs, because sometimes a student wants a PhD, and there's no reason if they really want one that they shouldn't get it. But then we better be thinking hard about other career opportunities, and we haven't done a very good job of that, you know, how you can use that PhD in other areas beyond academic and academic track. So I hear you. It's really a concern. It's a concern in the sciences as well. We've got lots of students. Every faculty member wants students in their lab, because to be successful, again, here's where the self-interest lines up, where a faculty member wants a big lab with lots of hands. But those students need jobs. And, you know, often in the sciences, they go into these postdocs, but that's like a big buffer. And you think you think they're being productive, you know, but they're actually not getting jobs on the other side of this experience. So I think it's a problem across academia, and I think we have to start controlling the numbers, and we have been. In a number of the social science areas and humanities, there have been decreases in the number of graduate students. If you look at the demographics of UCLA today, there are fewer graduate students than there were 10 years ago. So a good point, and we're concerned about it. You know, I've never heard that before. I mean, it's interesting, and I've never heard that criticism.
I've heard that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, women who are dating wealthy, other students that are wealthy?
Yeah. So
Older men.
right.
Older men.
So I'll add this. I have not seen UCLA in this or heard of it in my experience. So you'd have to tell me where that is. But I have been paying attention to those stories. And essentially, it gets to the affordability question, right? And so as students are struggling to pay for these increased tuition and fees and their housing and that sort of thing, and this is across the United States, and particularly its center, the epicenter of this was on the East Coast. And so and one news story interviewed young women and asked them how were they doing, and they were showing a group of women who were making making money, not being dates, sort of a dating service with older guys. I will say, I think, first of all, that whole story broke on television through a documentary. Or I shouldn't say documentary, but let's just say it broke on television because I don't know how widespread that is. I didn't think it was a balanced story to begin with. It is, I think the women that were in that film were telling the truth for their experiences, and there was certainly desperation around that. But I can't say that in my 40 years in higher education, I've heard that on a college campus that I've been on. So I'm happy to talk to you later and find out more about where that is, because if that's out there, I certainly want to know about it, because we are very concerned about the well-being of our students. And I've made it clear to my staff in the financial aid area, which falls under enrollment. I've said this knowing that we don't have all the resources, but I say to them, I don't want a single student to leave here, UCLA, because of a lack of resources. If I have to get on the phone, talk to my colleagues in development, and we've had some success in working that out, right? Changing expectation that it's not always going to be grants and scholarships, but figuring out a way for our students to stay there. Now there are other issues, as you well know, and food insecurity, and too many students living in an apartment trying to make ends meet. But I've not heard that in my personal or professional experience.
I haven't heard it either, but it's I'll certainly be alert to looking into this, because we very close to student affairs. We hear a lot about students' concerns, and that's one I've never heard a student raise. But sometimes I'm not always the one who hears about these issues. So thank you.
I would just add, from the federal standpoint, the issue of affordability of higher education is a big issue in both parties, in both houses of Congress, as they consider the Higher Education Act reauthorization. So how far they'll go remains to be seen, if they go.
I think you had your hand up first.
In your opening remarks, Chancellor Block, you mentioned things you're looking at to help, fund the school, and you talked about like online courses. I actually kind of see online courses as an access issue as well for like students that can't, come to a campus and be there 4 years and stuff like that. Do you see like your online courses kind of beyond like just the extension? As I remember, it's been a long time since I've been on campus, but like as a way to actually help students get through like a 4-year degree, or, because I know like Purdue and Penn State, they're doing a lot of that kind of work, and I was just wondering if UCLA is looking at similar things.
We're doing that as well. So we have a number of courses online this summer for bottleneck courses, so that a student can keep progressing even if they're home working, for example, during the summer. So we're using, I say, we're not leaders in online education. We've been very conservative, our faculty. We offer very few degrees online. We've got a very good master's in engineering that's actually the best in the country. But we've been very careful about online programs. But we do use it to supplement in-class experience pretty effectively. So, there's a couple of different classes of online, now the different sort of categories. I mean, one is really online to serve our students and residents to supplement. The other is to provide, fully online programs. Some of those can be profitable if they're in areas of technical training or, business degrees or things that we are certainly considering for revenue generation. But we're also using online to reach people as a public university for access. So it's a sort of a dual role here. But we are using it. And some universities, and I'll mention one who's controversial but highly innovative and a good friend, Michael Crow from Arizona State University, is sort of breaking the mold of the modern university, for better or worse, because there are a lot of critics of Michael. But Michael has a huge online program where he sees this continuum from students that are full residents to partial residents to non-residents. And he has a program with Starbucks for employees. So I think good for Michael. I mean, I think he's shaking up, higher education, and in good ways that we're all thinking about, what's he doing and what can we copy.
Oh, all right, then we'll come back.
I'm going to tie a few things together in terms of the issues of online, of access, of any number of other things. There's a lot of chatter about free tuition, but there's not a lot of informed commentary. Could you give us something very quickly? Obviously, the bills are still in draft language, but your opinions. Free isn't free, and we all know that, but that's not getting talked about.
Yeah. I mean, I think from my perspective is even free community college tuition in California is a struggle. I mean, which is very modest to begin with, but even just providing that, I'm not sure the state really has the resources or the will to provide free education. To provide free education, 4-year education is fantastically expensive for the country, and I don't think it's realistic. And then why would taxpayers want to provide free education for students whose families can really afford to pay tuition? I think what our model, which I'm more attracted by, is that we provide as best as we can free tuition for students that need it, and for families that can afford it, they can pay tuition. So I'm not a big fan of free tuition for everybody. I'm certainly in favor of access and providing free tuition where students absolutely need that assistance.
The free tuition has been considered as one of these federal-state partnership concepts in the Higher Education Act reauthorization. But even Senator Murray has said, in a divided Congress, it's not clear that, that bold a step would occur, and there are policy reasons, too, that it might not go forward. But there are a number of different types of programs, and so it's not always clear, what people mean, as you say.
Doesn't really seem realistic when you consider the number of students and the cost of educating them.
Thank you all for your excellent remarks here this evening. I've enjoyed it immensely. My question is that I'm reading that there are some student movements on some campuses around the country where they're renaming dorms or streets or other places that are named for, say, California missionaries in Western academic institutions, or for former plantation owners, 150, 200 years ago in Southern and Eastern academic institutions. How do you consider requests like that and movements that students bring forward for your attention in that regard?
Challenging. We have, fortunately, maybe this is the advantage of having a young university. I think, our buildings are named, best we can tell, for, we think, very appropriate. Most of the older buildings are named after, well-known people in the state. Newer buildings are named after donors who are vetted pretty carefully before we make that commitment. But I think we've escaped from that. We have some movement of some buildings to be renamed. I mean, we have students who feel that some names should, and that's a slow process. We certainly consider it, and we look into the history of a building naming. But on other campuses, this has been a much more volatile discussion than it is on UCLA. I don't know if
I think you're right. I mean, we're a baby in the space of higher education, which is over 400 years of age, and so the country was very different then. And I think our youth just allows us to escape some of that, But
That's right. Being young here helps.
These are tough issues, right? Yeah. I really think this is about, at some level, not totally, about students feeling a sense of belonging. Being able to envision themselves being on campus, feeling safe, trying to make cultural shifts that allows every student to flourish at these colleges and universities. Some of it is just politics, but I think that there are some things that we can learn from the conversation.
I think we've got time for one or two more. So one over here and one over here, and then we may need to wrap it up.
Just getting back to the cost-efficient side of education for years and years. I've had friends and family who spend 2 years in community college and then transfer into a higher education school. Is that still going on? Is there a high percentage of that going on now, or no? Yeah.
So we are, I would say here, I'd say we're best in class. So we have, this is the California Master Plan. It was a great plan when it was launched, in the 60s, and it's a great plan still, that about a third of our students are transfer students. They're only allowed to transfer after their second year, so they come in the third year. So every so 1 out of 3 students in, I guess, the third, fourth years are transfers largely from community colleges. So that means immediately they've had 2 much less expensive years of college. So it's amazing cost savings by going to community college. The students are more diverse in every dimension. I think it's really an interesting group of students come in through transfer, and I think enrich the whole campus with their experiences, because their experiences are varied. Many are older. They're just great students. So that continues, and it's actually, we've led the UCLA, UCLA's really led the campuses of the California system in the number of transfers. You know, the goal was, I think, 2 to 1, and we've been more than 2 to 1, you know,
Yes,
for
a long
many
time.
years, so we're very proud of it. We look at our community college students, and we see how they do compared to our freshmen, students starting as freshmen. I think they graduate proportionally in the same amount of time, about the same grade point average, seem to be going on to the same careers. It's pretty successful, you know, because we've accepted students who've already done well in college. So we really have some data on their performance. So it's a part we're very proud of.
It's a great response to some of the issues that we're finding, and you know, even for diversity. Too many of our students who are from lower income backgrounds start their educations at 2-year colleges. And I think one of the things we've done in the University of California system is made it simpler for students to transfer as well, by giving what we call pathways to college. But across the UC system, students are taking a common curriculum for the same major, you know, for the 9 undergraduate campuses. So it works. We ought to do more of it.
Yeah, and I think that's where we get largely our veterans come
Yeah.
largely from community college. We pick up our veterans, we pick up former foster youth, and we pick up really an interesting group of young people.
I should note one thing that UCLA has done really a tremendous job at. When I moved out to California first in the mid-90s, only about 40% of undergraduates were completing their degree in 4 years. And the numbers are now up to, I think at UCLA it's close to 70% now
Right.
that are finishing. And you know, one of the things that we know is that if people don't finish within 6 years, they're probably not going to finish. Right. So, you know, getting people, it's important to get people in, but it's also important to get them out.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
They don't want to leave. They don't
want to
leave.
And, you know, UCLA has had tremendous success at that, so you should be.
Thank you. We tell them not to get too comfortable. You know, someone's waiting for their seat. You know?
I wanted to go back to the subject of scholarships and private donations for scholarships. I'm currently a senior, and I spent the last 9 months interning for development. I understand that UCLA operates on a donor-based model, but I also understand that that model is not fulfilling our scholarship needs, and that we're lagging behind in our centennial goal for scholarships. So I'm wondering, how do we address that need using the model that we have?
Right. So I would say we're lagging, but we set a very stretch goal. So we set a goal. So the current campaign had a $4.2 billion goal, and in that was $1 billion in scholarships, which is incredible. Very few schools would ever set a $1 billion goal for scholarships. We've raised so far, I think, $512 million in scholarships. So that's a big number, but we haven't raised the billion. And the campaign has exceeded already its overall goal. It's already about $4.6 billion. So it's, you know, the campaign itself is doing really well. But not every part of the campaign has met its goals. And admittedly, the scholarship goal is really a stretch goal. It's my highest priority, and we're laser focused, and we might not reach it, you know, $1 billion. So what we do is we'll continue on after the campaign. There may be a mini campaign just for undergraduate education, for example. We'll focus. We've got to keep raising money for scholarships. But I think, you know, it's interesting because the Daily Bruin beats me up on this routinely, and I keep reminding them that yes, we haven't reached $1 billion, but $512 million is a lot of money, you know, for anyone. It's a lot of money. So we are, I think, doing well. We're just not, you know, we're not where we need to be, and it's so important if we want to maintain access. We've got to, and you know, as I'm reminded by the vice provost regularly at admissions time, is that the difference between a student going to Stanford or going to UCLA often is really scholarship support, because you know the privates can offer sometimes full support, and we often can't. So we are laser focused on it, and I think we will be successful, but it may take longer than this campaign.
I can't resist the temptation to say, this is where you all get involved, right?
Thank you for the opening. Yeah, right. Support a student. That's great.
So we could keep doing this all night, but we do have to give the room back. So I want to thank our panelists and all of you for asking such good questions. Good night, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.